Welcome, everyone. My name is Hailey Cusimano, and I am a GMAT tutor, instructor, and content creator. And I'm so excited to be back here with GMAT Club to be chatting with you guys for the third lesson in our installment about reading comprehension. So as you can see, we're running a live lesson. So those of you tuning in live, first and foremost, feel free to jump into the chat and let me know where you're tuning in from. Give me a quick hello, because as we move through today's lesson, I'd love to hear a little bit from you all around any questions that you have, whether they refer specifically to the passage that we'll be covering today, or more to the bigger picture around strategies, processes, etc. with reading comprehension. I've tried to make a point today to save a little bit more time for Q&A and bigger picture takeaways, since this is the third and final installment of our RC series. So looking forward to that. And I've got a pretty nice passage up for today. For those of you guys who read the title of today's lesson, you saw that we're going to be talking a little bit about the fact that we don't really need to be too concerned about the science of sciencey passages or the terminology of history passages. Welcome from India, from Bangladesh. Wonderful. Thank you guys for joining. And essentially the idea that whatever our process is, it should remain consistent from passage to passage. So essentially the passage type shouldn't be a driving force behind whether we're successful on reading comprehension passages or not. And in many cases for students, especially for students earlier on in their process, it absolutely is. In many cases, if you error log or reflect at all in your practice, which is a process that I very, very strongly recommend in some form or fashion, you may find that when you're going through reading comprehension passages that you run into trouble on the same types of questions. Maybe inference questions you don't feel like you have a super powerful strategy for, and those feel problematic for you. Or perhaps primary purpose, big picture questions aren't your favorite thing in the world. But for many students in many cases, whether or not they're successful on passages is hit or miss depending on the passage itself and how well they felt they were able to engage with or interact with that passage. And that's really where strategy comes into play. Because if you find that on some passages you're really comfortable, maybe you like the content, or it's something you feel you relate to a little more directly, you might find that you run through the passages and the corresponding questions with no problem or with relative ease. And then you encounter that dense, lengthy, kind of boring reading comprehension passage about worms or planets or whatever it is that doesn't quite float your boat in terms of content, and you tend to run into trouble. And when this happens, students will really often find that they run into a lot more fluctuation in their verbal performance. Some verbal performances are really strong, and other verbal performances in practice tests and on test day end up being weaker depending on what passages they happen to see. And the reason we want to think about being so strategic about reading comprehension, the reason we want to be reading for the why rather than reading for the what, and ensuring that we're focusing on what matters without getting caught up on what doesn't, is because we want to make sure that we're not in a position where we're seeing a drastic level of shift, practice test to practice test, or test sitting to test sitting, where we tend to run into trouble. Ooh, so like more of the literature-based passages run you into a little more trouble, Ashish. So you're not alone there. For many folks, it's not necessarily the content and the scientific nature of it. It might be the language style. Some of those passages that are written using terminology and using a style of writing that's a little more poetic in some ways and a little less straightforward, to the point, business executive summary can be a little tricky as well. And so I would encourage you guys to reflect on what those opportunities look like in your practice. Do you find that your opportunities are more passage related or more question related? And if they're more passage related, that's probably a pretty good indication that a little more structure into how you're thinking about, how you're approaching, and how you're applying yourself passage to passage should help build on that consistency. Because at the end of the day, the passage type shouldn't matter. The core construction of the passage is generally of the same length. When we encounter really lengthy scientific or really lengthy history passages, it's generally because they've included more scientific processes. They've included more supporting examples. They've included more context that's helpful on detail-driven questions, but won't really matter to us until we're asked about it. Because the name of the game today is the fact that you don't need to become a subject matter expert to be successful on the GMAT, and the GMAT, even on the verbal end of things, is not meant to be a vocabulary-driven passage, right? Or a vocabulary-driven testing sequence. So if you don't know the meaning to a word, particularly as a native English speaker, but even in many cases as a non-native English speaker, there's a really good chance you won't need to, because the passage is asking you to use context, or it's asking you to understand the movement of the science without necessarily having to dig into the details of that science. And so we're going to look at a scientific passage today that speaks to exactly that. It's probably not what most of you guys would be choosing to read in your spare time. And if it is, kudos, it's a pretty boring, lengthy passage about worms. So spoiler alert there. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the fact that the length of the passage and the density of the passage and all of these supporting details shouldn't, to Ayusha's point, be a pain, because they shouldn't inherently be more time consuming. If we're reading for the right stuff, if we're reading for the big picture, and if we're learning to understand and contextualize the movement of scientific processes and why scientific processes are there without getting too caught up in the details of those processes and trying to understand the inner workings of the science, well, then we're going to be able to move just as efficiently regardless of the passage type at hand. And that's really the takeaway that we're going for. So as we move through today's passage, by all means, feel free to jump in with questions, whether they are bigger picture questions that just relate to general RC strategy. I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for that today, or whether they relate specifically to the passage at hand. And with that, I'm going to have us go ahead and get started so we can get a little context going. We can look at things from the perspective of this passage. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is share my screen with you. And for those of you who can't see this great on screen, I will pass along a link to the passage as well. But I'd like to go ahead and give you guys, just like the last couple of lessons in our set, 3 minutes to see if you can make a habit of pausing at the close of each paragraph of this passage and just answering the question, why? Why was this paragraph here? What was it trying to accomplish? What would the passage lack if it were taken away? Because if we can contextualize that why, we can build it into the why of the passage as a whole, and it's going to keep us from hyper-focusing on terminology that we might not be all that familiar with, terminology that might not seem all that interesting to us, and that may never become relevant to us if it's never posed in a question or if it's posed utilizing context. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that we can get started. And I'd like to go ahead and give you guys that 3 minutes just to lead the way. So I'll hop off screen for the next 3 minutes. Just pause at the close of each of these paragraphs and see if you can answer the question, why? Why is this paragraph here? And then don't worry about the questions just yet. Feel free to work ahead if you've got the time to do so. We're going to run through each of these questions and talk about how these questions are prime examples for how to think critically when reading comprehension becomes lengthier, becomes a little more dense, becomes a little more challenging. So with that, go ahead and take 3 minutes, and then we're going to talk through this passage together. All right, let's go ahead and chat a little bit. So for those of you who are perhaps still wrapping up the final paragraph, still trying to work the rest of the way through this passage, I mentioned this in the earlier videos of this series. I would encourage you not to try to outpace your natural reading comprehension speed. If you know it takes you a little longer to break down and read the passage, fine. Make adjustments elsewhere. Look to minimize that time invested by identifying and keeping high value add time and identifying and minimizing or eliminating low value add time. But ultimately, if you needed a little extra time to dig into this passage, well, then that's going to be your best bet. However, if it took you more than about 3 or so minutes to dig into this passage, you were probably focusing on the wrong things. You're probably focusing on the wrong stuff, because the core construction of this passage is fairly straightforward. There's a lot of terminology that you're probably not familiar with, but the actual core construction of the passage is fairly straightforward. And I had a question in the chat around, hey, is it really necessary to do this summary before we dig into the questions? While that might look a little different for everyone, and you should ultimately pursue the path that leaves you feeling your most confident through each question you encounter, I would argue that taking in some capacity the time to understand why the passage has been included will increase your efficiency as a whole. Now, it may not be that you're digging in and rereading through details, and it should not be that you're digging in and rereading through details, but even if you're looking to the big picture and using cue and indicative language, so contrast and continuation language, evidence and conclusion language, or maybe you're taking a moment to contextualize the why in the bigger picture and seeing how that builds from each paragraph, I would argue that taking the time to understand the bigger picture context of the passage, even if things seem to shift really drastically paragraph to paragraph, puts you in a better position in the questions. It's going to allow you to understand where to find the details on detail-driven questions, where to find the support on inference-driven questions. And as you guys can probably see, we're going to be looking at a couple of inference questions today. And it allows us to answer function-driven questions. Why was this detail here? Why was this example included? You guys might remember back to some of the function questions we encountered last week in our passage last week. And it allows us to answer big picture questions like the primary purpose of the main idea, generally without much reference back to the passage. And that's really the big takeaway, is we should never fear returning to the passage to find support, but we want to do so strategically. We don't want to just sit and reread entire chunks of the text if we have a sense of the bigger picture outline. Now, let's talk through that together, right? And that's exactly what we're going to do right now for now. Yeah, is we're going to take this paragraph by paragraph. So if I were to take a look at paragraph 1, read through paragraph 1, and I were to summarize for myself in the context of less than a sentence, just a few words, why paragraph 1 was here. Why was it here? What was it trying to accomplish? Why was it here? What was it trying to accomplish? And those of you guys who were here with me in the earlier lessons know I'm not big on note-taking. Generally speaking, when students tend to note-take extensively, they're note-taking for the wrong things. They're note-taking for the details rather than the big picture. But if it's helpful for you to jot down these couple of words as you go, feel free to do so. If that helps take the pressure off of mentally storing that information, that's perfectly fine. If you're finding that the Cliff Notes abbreviation of your passage starts to get to be the length of the passage itself, you run into some trouble. But a couple of words here and there, particularly with different perspectives that appear, different terms that speak to the big picture, things like different discoveries or different hypotheses when they appear, then that's fine. I would not go too much more detail-driven than that. So paragraph 1 essentially is saying, hey, there are these two worms. We used to think they were different worms, but they're really the same worm. How cool, how interesting. I know that this is probably a little more scientific than most of what you would imagine reading in your spare time, at least for many of us, right? Yeah, these two worms are really the same one worm, right? And it's not trying to convince us of that. This is not an opinionated passage where they're trying to tell us, trying to convince us that this is the case. We're saying here's the current knowledge in the scientific community. How about in paragraph 2? If we had to address, just in the context of a few words, why paragraph 2 has been included. So we've got a pretty common structure here. Yeah, so it's starting to give us some of the details of one of these two subsets of worm, right? Here's all this information about the heat worm. right? We've got its cilia, we've got its location, its temperature, we've got all this different information about what we're referring to as the heat worm. Now, the details of that information do not matter to us now. If we're asked about them, we know to find them in paragraph 2. And if you found it helpful to write paragraph 2, details on heat worm, fine. I wouldn't go too much more in depth than that. So how about in paragraph 3? Pretty common structural component to what we've been talking about so far. Now we're talking about the details of the other worm, the blue worm, right? So we know if we have questions that ask us specifically for the details of the blue worm to find them in paragraph 3. We don't care about them just yet. If you took a bunch of time trying to break down what they mean by keratin and how the keratin interact with the cilia and how they interact in the bark of a tree versus underwater, you went way too in the weeds on this passage. We're just looking to the big picture. So then how about in our final paragraph? Final paragraph here. So this is a construction that we saw last week as well. And it's an important one to take note of. We've got some comparison and contrast. We're basically addressing, hey, here are the differences that led us to believe that they were different, but here's why they're actually the same. Yeah, so we've got some comparison and contrast going on in paragraph 4, and that tells me if I encounter questions that deal with comparison and contrast, I know where to find that support. And so if I build this into the primary purpose of the passage as a whole, we're actually not going to talk through the primary purpose question associated with this passage, but the big takeaway that I would gather is that it's a fairly explanatory, dry passage that's just explaining the process by which we determined that 2 worms are, well, they're really the same one worm, right? So it's explaining some of the details of a scientific fact, of a scientific discovery. And so if we keep that in mind, in many cases, wrong answer constructions on dry explanatory passages, particularly for things like the primary purpose or main idea, will take things too far and give us a little more satisfying an answer to this question, so what, why is this here, but one that doesn't align with the passage. So be wary of dry explanatory passages where answer options for the primary purpose say things like to talk about how important it is to work together, or to address, to give an example of the types of scientific processes and discoveries being made. Well, we want to be wary here that if it doesn't provide the context for a more satisfying so what, a more satisfying, all right, why did I just spend 3 minutes reading about worms? Well, then it's not our correct answer. And so here, all we're doing is showing some of the facts of a scientific discovery. Now, with that in mind, we had a lot of pretty dense details. And you'll notice when we dig into the 3 questions that I've gone ahead and selected for us for this passage, that they're going to ask us to dig into those details for support. They're going to ask us to do so in a really specific way because our first 2 questions here are inference questions. Does anyone who was at my last lesson remember what I spoke about in the differentiation between correct answers and incorrect answers on inference questions? What makes something an inference? What's the bar to entry for an inference question? There's a very specific term here. So we're looking to distinguish, using pretty primarily process of elimination, what must be true from what could be false. Because as soon as something could be false, as soon as something is maybe likely but not guaranteed or doesn't necessarily need to be the case on the basis of the passage, it's not an inference. So we're going to use some process of elimination here. And our first question asks us, it can be inferred from the passage that compared to blue worms found in the sea, heat worms found in rainforests. Yeah, must be true versus could be true, could be false, right? If it's a maybe, could be true, could be false, it's not an inference, which makes these really awesome contenders for process of elimination. So I'm going to let you guys take the next 90 seconds to try to apply that process of elimination, to dig into question 1 and see if you can address what can be inferred from the passage, comparing blue worms found in the sea to heat worms found in rainforests. And I will preface this by saying, be careful. Make sure that you're on the lookout for the precision in language in this question. We are advised not to reread the passages, but in the cases of a few lines, which are usually context or key lines, is it okay to reread and comprehend? Absolutely. That's a great question. So here's my general 2 cents on rereads of the information. it is very likely that you'll need to return to the passage for probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the questions you encounter. Anything that isn't a big picture question dealing with the context of the passage as a whole, you will probably need to return to the passage to, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine, because if you're reading efficiently in the first place, I gave you guys a little more time than you hopefully ought to be spending on test day. But if you're reading with the right context in the first place, you should have time to return to the passage. Now, here's how we want to go about that process. If we have a detail-driven question where we know, to your point, Fernell, we know that the detail is housed in one specific part of the passage. Maybe we know it's toward the end of paragraph 2, or we know it's that first sentence of paragraph 3. Well, then return to the passage and reread that detail. Absolutely. Don't be afraid to return to the passage. It's not going to destroy you on time. There are adjustments we can make to make sure that you're still feeling comfortable with your pacing without feeling like this isn't the open book test that it is, right? This is open book. We've got the passage in front of us. Use it, but use it efficiently. So if we know it refers us back to a particular detail or a particular component, go ahead and go back to reread. But if it could come up throughout the passage as a whole, if that supporting detail could come up throughout entire paragraphs of the passage, or different answer options come up in different paragraphs throughout the passage, rather than rereading the entire passage or large chunks of that passage, what you'll want to do is you'll want to scan to eliminate any answer choices that are obviously incorrect first. So anything that just clearly doesn't fit the bill, clearly doesn't comply. And then from there, we can take a step back and we can return to components of the passage on a case-by-case basis, on an answer choice by answer choice basis, if I know where the supporting detail for each of those answer choices is housed. So the idea isn't not to return to the passage, it's to return to the passage strategically, to return to the passage and to know where to look so that we're not investing a bunch of time rereading supporting details that still aren't relevant to us because they aren't focused on what the question has asked us for. So we'll talk more about that when we get into this first question, but I'm going to go ahead and let you guys lead the way through it. So let's go ahead and take 90 seconds. Just toss your answers into the chat for me. And then we're going to regroup in 90 seconds and talk through question 1 together to help contextualize how we find the support, how we know where to look, kind of how that should build from our analysis of the passage in our initial read through, and kind of where to go from there. So let's go ahead and take 90 seconds, and then we'll address some of the questions that we've got going in the chat in the context of this first example. Go ahead and go for it. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about it, because we've got a bit of a split opinion here between answer option B and answer option E. And that tends to pretty often be the case here. So again, inference question, pretty process of elimination driven. I don't know that heat worms found in rainforests don't graze on bacteria. I don't know, and this one's one of my favorites, that if I just took a heat worm found in rainforest and I plopped it in the water, that it wouldn't survive, right? Like maybe it'll adapt really quickly. They are, after all, the same worm. Nor do I know, let's talk about answer choice D, that they have little chance to grow because of extreme temperature. This sounds really on topic. And if we're thinking about where we should find the support here, well, when we're comparing blue worms found in the sea to heat worms found in rainforests, where would we be expected to find the support for that comparison and contrast? I mentioned it just a moment ago. Anytime you've got a paragraph with the primary intention of drawing a comparison and contrast, pay attention to that. There's a really decent chance that at least one corresponding question will draw your attention to that comparison or contrast. And here, that was in paragraph 4. Paragraph 4 addressed the apparent differences, the visual differences between the two worms, despite them being, at the end of the day, the same worm. And when they did so, right, we're told the freezing temperatures trigger the production of keratin so quickly that the worm has little chance to grow, thus keeping its volume approximately 1/4 that of the larger worm. But which worm are we talking about here at the close of paragraph 4? Well, that's the blue worm found in the ocean. And so when we've got contrasting opinions or contrasting perspectives or contrasting subspecies of this animal, right, of this worm, well, we want to make sure that we're answering things from the correct perspective, because answer choice D sounds really on topic. It uses a lot of the same terminology that we saw in the passage. It seems to speak to one of those major differences that are addressed in paragraph 4, but it does so from the wrong perspective. We're looking at things from the perspective of heat worms found in rainforests, and that's not what we were given in the passage, right? The worm in the context of this passage was the blue worm, the one in freezing temperatures that has little chance to grow because it has to constantly create this keratin that houses it and keeps it from freezing. So answer choice D can be eliminated because it answers things from the wrong perspective. And very, very often, I mentioned this in an earlier lesson, our most convincing wrong answers will answer things from the wrong perspective. They'll answer the wrong component of cause-effect relationships, or perhaps they'll speak to a different perspective than the perspective that the question stem called us to answer from, which we saw in our very first passage example in week 1 of this series. So a couple of you guys chose answer choice B. Let's talk about it. Do not have high levels of hydrostatic pressure. Well, what's high levels of hydrostatic pressure? What qualifies as high versus low levels of this pressure? We may be able to draw some level of comparison of higher or lower, but do not have high levels of hydrostatic pressure. This is certainly not guaranteed to me. Again, it uses a buzzword. It uses a term that perhaps we were a little intimidated by in the passage, but it certainly doesn't have to be true in the context of this passage. However, again, comparison and contrast, in many cases, what makes this an inference question is that they'll present the comparison from one perspective and then they'll ask about it from the opposite perspective. And they want us to be able to determine if A is larger than B, B is smaller than A. If A is faster than B, B is slower than A, right? And so on and so forth with this comparison. And if we can see that, it's a really, really great opportunity for GMAT questions to become a little more abstracted without inherently being all that much more challenging. So if I know that the blue worm stays smaller because it produces keratin so quickly that it has little chance to grow, well then what do I know about the larger worm that does have the opportunity to grow? Well, it replaces keratin more slowly. So we want to be really careful here because, again, on inference questions, which tend to rank among the questions that students, at least initially, have some challenges with, we're looking to differentiate what must be true from what could be false. So as soon as you can make a case for how something could be false, despite the context of the passage, it's not our correct answer in an inference question. And that's that distinction that we want to be making. So Don't worry, we're going to be able to practice this in another example because our next question is also an inference question. Now, if you have any questions for me on that last one, definitely dive in and let me know. If you have any bigger picture questions for me, feel free to jump in. So Neil says, a lot of time I'm stuck between the final two choices and end up choosing the wrong one. How do I improve on that? Really, really awesome question. So first and foremost, I will address, most people get this perspective of, I'm most of the way through the question. I was, 99% of the way there because I was able to narrow down to 2. And I don't mean this negatively, although there's a chance it'll come off this way. Ultimately, it's challenging to develop answer options that are all equally likely wrong answers, right? Perhaps a certain answer option will speak to a different trap or flaw in the construction that students are prone to. But generally speaking, you'll only have about 1 or 2 convincing wrong answers that will hold any merit based on your approach, right? So getting down to a 50-50 shot doesn't mean that you have done that portion of the work, that you've done most of the work on it, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking for the potential to really dig in and reflect on what it was about the wrong answer that we found convincing and what it was about the right answer that caused us to eliminate it. And in the context of verbal specifically, so now, I will say really leaning a little more heavily into process of elimination should resolve a lot of the problem that you're running into. Because if your process is that you narrow down to 2 answer options, but then you pick the one that you like better between those remaining 2 answer options, you are more likely to make the wrong selection than narrowing down to the final 2 answer options and finding something definitively wrong with one of those 2 answer options. And that's the big thing I want to make sure that we're taking away, is that there's going to be something to like about a lot of the answer choices that you encounter. There's going to be something that sounds a lot like the way that you would have preempted or anticipated the answer yourself. But there will also be something that landmines absolutely all but one answer option and makes it definitively wrong. Definitively means for elimination. And so process of elimination should be a primary tool that you're taking into these questions, especially when it comes to the inference questions. So to make a long-winded answer short, 2 things. 1, reflecting to identify what it is about wrong answer constructions that you liked and what about right answer constructions caused you to eliminate them. And then shifting your approach into a little more primarily a focus on process of elimination should help you start to address that. So the term replace put me off. I thought the production of keratin was discussed in the passage. So it is discussed in the passage. So I want to make sure that I understand your qualm with this one, because they can change the terminology, and as long as the meaning stays the same, there's no rule that says we have to maintain the same terms, right? And in many cases, they'll very intentionally, they will by design shift the way that they've gone about the terminology to try to make it a little less word for word. Although, we mentioned in an earlier lesson, something being too directly stated doesn't make it not an inference, right? So in this case, if we're saying that for the blue worm, the freezing temperatures trigger the production of keratin so quickly, right, that the worm has little chance to grow. Well, then what do we know about the larger worm that does have the chance to grow and lives in less rigid freezing temperatures? Well, we know that it replaces keratin more slowly because that's the only feasible way that it could grow to the larger size. And furthermore, if we're presenting this directly as a point of contrast, again, we can draw the opposite conclusion, or rather the complementary conclusion about the other worm. So let's go ahead and dig into our second question. And it should help us to continue to contextualize what's happening and how we can really lean into process of elimination on inference-driven questions. And again, the point that I want to make here is that meanings of crucial words in the passage. Talk to me a little bit about what that means, because if you're looking to the meaning of words like keratin and cilia and some of the more dense terminology that will appear in, say, passages about planets, right? Sometimes we'll even hit situations where they'll give us names that contain both letters and numbers. All of that stuff is there with the intention of trying to intimidate you. But ultimately, I don't need to know that scientific terminology to be successful. Now, if you're finding that transitionary language, if you're finding that language that was meant to interpret a big picture, does run you into trouble. So for instance, in the passage that we went through last week, we had an answer choice that dealt with like the word phenomenon, right? Maybe you wouldn't have called it a phenomenon, but it could comply as a phenomenon. Well, then continue to build on the context. The answer to your question is use context and eliminate answer options only when we know that they do not align with that context, because wording should very much be secondary. We want to make sure we're not changing the meaning as we interpret that wording. But wording should be very secondary, and meaning is primarily what we use to try to break things down. And if you feel that you miss some of that meaning, use context, use the surrounding context to guide you, because chances are that's what that GMAT passage is asking you to do. So with that, I've already given you guys too much time on this, but I'm still going to formally get you your 90 seconds here. Go ahead and take a look at question 2. Okay, let's go ahead and get back to it. And actually, before we dig into question 2, I had a really great question from Ayush around how I knew that the worm in the last sentence was referring to blue worms. And that is, again, a fairly redundant answer, but it's context, right? It's being able to look earlier in the paragraph and say, okay, large worm found in the rainforest, right? This tells me, both through the context of the earlier paragraphs and earlier in that paragraph at hand, that the larger worm is the one that's in the rainforest, right? It molts as it grows, and it's able to increase a very small amount each time. And then we're told the smaller worm, which must, by contrast, refer to the blue worm, right? If the heat worm is the one that's found in rainforests and becomes larger, then by contrast, the blue worm is the smaller worm referenced later on in the paragraph that can't afford this much exposure because it's in freezing temperatures underwater. So hopefully that clarifies. The big picture answer there is context, utilizing the context from earlier in the paragraph and elsewhere in the passage. Now, I had a lot of you guys on the right track with this question. No one really fell as heavily into the trap answer as, generally speaking, students do for this question. So it can be inferred that if the cilia of a blue worm found on the seafloor were to become damaged, preventing the sensing of warmer temperatures, the worm. Keep in mind, preventing the sensing of warmer temperatures, that in many cases, additional context can be given to us in the question stem itself. If we think back to like data sufficiency question strategies in quant, right? Sometimes some of the valuable context and information that we've been given won't just be given to us in the statements. It'll also be given to us in the stem. The same thing is very much true here, where in question 2, one of the powerful driving forces that we needed to effectively answer this question, it wasn't just in the passage. It was housed in the stem itself. So if we know that this relationship exists, well, we're looking at the blue worm found on the seafloor. Well, we talked about the blue worm found in the seafloor in paragraph 3. And we said that the cilia sensed when the temperature was high enough to allow the production of keratin to slow so that it was able to more easily graze. So if the default is that it produces and produces and produces all of this keratin, and then the cilia goes, whoa, whoa, whoa there, it's warm enough. You probably got to eat at some point. Let's slow this whole thing down. Well, then if the cilia became damaged, and specifically it became damaged in a sense that it prevented the sensing of warmer temperatures, well, what's going to happen? We definitely don't know that it's going to grow, right? Or that it would be forced to find its way to warmer temperatures. It sounds like it doesn't quite have the ability to do that at this point. Or that it would experience some sort of sudden drop in hydrostatic pressure. Generally speaking, students tend to be pretty torn between answer choices B and C. And they'll be torn between these answer choices because they'll assume that the relationship works both ways. That the cilia senses the warmer temperatures and tells it to slow the production, and senses the colder temperatures and tasks it to create more keratin. But let's pay close attention to the precision in language here. We're told that the default, right, the go-to, what happens automatically is that the production of keratin just keeps on going and going and going and going, and it creates this great big wall of keratin that makes it difficult for the worm to graze. Well, then, if that default kept on going, if we didn't have the cilia able to say, whoa, 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 slow down there, you need to eat, it's not that it would be in danger of freezing. It's that it might not be able to gain enough nourishment to sustain life. If the go-to is to put on 1,000 jackets and gloves and hats and mittens and check the weather app to see what the temperature is. Now, I'm in sunny Central Florida, so this is a terrible example for me, but bear with me here. And my weather app becomes damaged, it doesn't work. If my default is to put on a whole bunch of sweaters before I go out for the day, well, then I'm not going to be in danger of freezing. I'm going to be in danger of being too bundled up in all these sweaters if the weather does happen to be warmer. Right? So the idea here is that we want to make sure we're using the context of not only the passage, but also the question stem to ensure that we're, one, answering the question that's been asked, and two, complying with the parameters that we've been given in that stem. Because in many cases, and we saw this even in our very first passage a couple of weeks ago, in many cases, challenging questions will become challenging not just because they ask you to do a little more digging to find the support in the passage. They'll become more challenging because they'll landmine important information in the question stem when we very often read so quickly through that stem so that we can get to the meat of the answer choices. We can start to dig into the analysis that we might be prone to miss out on those bigger picture takeaways. So we want to make sure we're paying close attention to the context of the question stem itself. And with that, I've got one more example for us that I want us to dig into with question 3. I know I had 1 or 2 of you guys already get started there. So let's go ahead and take another 90 seconds, and then we're going to start to talk a little big picture around what we can take away from this passage and how to be thinking about applying ourselves in challenging RC as a whole. So have at it. Take a minute and a half. All right, I'm seeing a little less participation on this last one, but let's go ahead and talk through it. So We're told, according to the passage, researchers were able to make the discovery of the unlikely relationship between these two worms because of which of the following. So, hey, there we go. So in this case, if we're looking to understand how they were able to make this discovery, this is a really great example of a case where we don't need to understand how hydrostatic pressure works, the thermostatic system of the heat worm versus the blue worm. We don't need to understand all of this scientific terminology or scientific process if we can understand the movement of the science, if we can understand the executive summary, if we can understand the story and how that story is changing. And in this case, what we're looking for is we're looking for the catalyst. Basically, what kick-started this conversation between scientists to say, hey, these two worms, they might really be the same worm. So what was it that allowed people to recognize that the two worms might actually be the same one worm? Where do we talk about the catalyst or the point at which people said, well, wait a second, we might need to do a little more digging here. Or wait a second, this might merit looking into a little further. Well, that was at the beginning of paragraph 3, right? Knowing that the only other roundworm with directional cilia is the blue worm, Dr. Bolton consulted with specialists. So yeah, it's true that both worms have mechanisms to produce keratin. It's true that both worms exist in extreme temperatures. It's also true that both worms are researched by the Institute of Helminthological Studies. So hey guys, if you change your mind about MBA plans, you could always go into a pursuit of studying about worms and become a helminthologist. I'm butchering the pronunciation there, but thankfully there is no pronunciation component on the GMAT. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be qualified to teach it to you guys. So in this case, yeah, they do both molt as they grow, but that's not how they were able to make this discovery, right? All of our wrong answer options here are true, and they're in the passage, but they don't answer the question that we were asked here. We weren't asked just something that is true between them or that they have in common. We wanted to know specifically what kickstarted this conversation. And that's that catalyst at the start of paragraph 3, where Dr. Bolton said, there are only two worms with directional cilia. I wonder if, maybe, perhaps, this is worth looking into and investigating further. So what allowed them to make that discovery? The fact that both worms feature directional cilia. So be careful. We're not just looking to determine what is true or false on the basis of the passage. We need to make sure that we are directly answering the question that we've been asked. So if you guys have questions for me there, definitely feel free to let me know. Shouldn't inherently be more time consuming if we're reading them with the right context, if we're reading to understand why, if we're reading to utilize surrounding context to help better tackle what's happening paragraph by paragraph, right? So the why of the second and third paragraph, when we spoke about that earlier, we mentioned that they were there to provide us with the details of this discovery, to say, hey, here's the situation for each of these worms. Now in the fourth paragraph, we're going to tie together how we knew that despite the fact that those worms appear different and have these pretty outward differences in their habitats, in their size, etc., right, that we're able to pull it together. Great question. So passage itself is a 650 to 700 level passage. These are the 3 most challenging questions associated with the passage. So they're all about 650 to 700 level questions. Yeah. So again, I have picked these ones in particular because they tend to run students into trouble. But you might find as you're going through that it's not the dense sciencey stuff that runs you into trouble. Someone mentioned a little earlier that it's the literature that tends to give them the most trouble because of the structure, the language that's used, or perhaps the language that they're assuming that we have comprehension of. So again, if you don't know the meaning of a term, there's a really good chance you don't have to, because it's either there to distract you or there to force you to use context to help understand how it puzzles into the rest of the passage as a whole. The answer to the third question was in the why of this. Oh, yes, correct. Yeah, that's exactly right, Gowrie. So we were able to look at this from what was happening in the very beginning of paragraph 2 to the very beginning of paragraph 3, right? We've got Dr. Ginny Bolton, who's basically discovering the cilia and then saying, wait a second, there's only one other roundworm with cilia. Let me talk to some people here. Let me do some digging. That's how we know that that was the catalyst, that was the movement that was happening in the passage. Again, without having to know all of the details of that passage. If we just look to what's happening at the beginning of that paragraph, in this case, sometimes it'll be housed elsewhere, but in this case, in the beginning of that paragraph, we can see the movement that's happening across the passage as a whole. Great question. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the screen share, but if you guys have lingering questions for me there, definitely feel free to let me know. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and start to round things out for today's lesson. Again, the takeaway that I'm hoping you guys will gather is that reflection is going to be the key to recognizing for you personally what those opportunity areas look like. Is it that dense scientific stuff tends to give you a pit in your stomach when you see it? Or do you find that the short and sweet passages end up not being so sweet because they ask us to dig in and break down more densely worded, almost sentence correction style terminology? We saw a little of that last week. So make sure that you're reflecting and identifying for you, as you move through passages, what your opportunity areas tend to be centered on. Are they passage focused? Are they question focused? And when you encounter that narrowing down to two options, what is it that causes you to make the selection of the incorrect one between the two, or to weed away the correct answer? So Red Hot Chips, I will say there isn't a direct answer to that question. I could get a little into the weeds of item response theory, which is super cool if you ever want to look it up, the way item response theory works. I think it's a lot of fun. I've done actually a decent bit of research on it. However, you definitely don't need to do that in your preparation for the GMAT. That's probably a little overkill. There isn't a definitive answer to that question because there are a whole bunch of other metrics that come into play in terms of the B values of the questions, the likelihood that you guess the question correct, which even though there's 5 answer choices with each question, is not always the same. It's not like sometimes we can narrow down to 2 really quickly. And the challenge is, where do we go from there? There's a little more that weighs into things there. However, I have found that for most students' cases, the adaptive algorithm tends to be more gradual than students tend to anticipate in many cases. Like, it's not you get one question right and immediately you're exclusively seeing the most challenging questions that you could possibly encounter. And that's a big one to keep in mind. So to contextualize, I scored perfectly on the verbal section of the test, and I actually have some enhanced score reports from others who scored perfectly on the verbal portion of the test, or at least very near to, with students that I've worked with, to where the difficulty level wasn't exclusively 700 plus at the halfway point, at the 3/4 point, even at, when we get a quarter of the way through the questions. The difficulty level lingers more toward the medium high level on average. Again, we don't know what the dispersion looks like, right? That's exactly right, because it's looking to understand the threshold of difficulty that you as a test taker can manage. And the way that they do that is not by shifting you drastically back and forth, but rather by trying to get a feel for that threshold. So happy to talk more offline about the adaptive algorithm. I think it's super cool. I think there's a lot of really fun stuff around data analytics that comes into play there. But for the purposes of your preparation, I would encourage you to make sure that you're focusing on building the floor rather than building the ceiling. Focusing on making sure that you feel really, really bulletproof at about the medium level, rather than trying to say, hey, I want a 700 plus score, so I'm going to exclusively practice 700 plus level questions. It's a really common mistake that students make in their prep that leaves them with lingering opportunity areas at about the medium level that falsely inform that algorithm that they can't handle the tough stuff. So start from the foundations, build the floor, make sure you feel really comfortable and really confident across the board at that medium level before you start to branch into that more challenging content, because it really does make an enormous difference. I've had students who have scored, mid to high 700 end performance scores without necessarily being able to tackle all of the most challenging material that they could possibly encounter, because they were just absolutely, completely confident through about the medium level. It's a way more primary indicator to your score, and so it's definitely what I would suggest focusing on until you hit that point where you feel confident at that level. So for someone who doesn't like jotting down notes in RC, is it important to write down a summary during practice? I would argue no. I think that if you've got a really solid mental outline, you're in really great shape. If you can pause and verbalize to yourself paragraph by paragraph the why behind that paragraph, you're golden. I don't note take. above and beyond that mental pause, paragraph by paragraph. Some will find that physically jotting it down takes away some of the pressure because it takes away some of the mental space that they're utilizing. If so, that's fine. But I generally do not recommend taking many, if any, notes as you move through the passage. So hopefully that addresses your question. I am going to go ahead and wrap up today's lesson, but if you have lingering questions that I haven't gotten to, whether you're joining me live or you're viewing this video after the fact, feel free to toss those questions into the comments and I'd be happy to address them. And otherwise, I hope to see you guys in another lesson sometime soon. So have an awesome rest of your day, no matter where you're tuning in from, and hope to see you back soon sometime.